Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Joshua Spodek, author of Leadership, Step by Step, Become the Person Others Follow. Joshua, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes, you did. Thank you. I'm glad to. Yeah.
Thank goodness. All right. Question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
The number one thing that worked for me is to write a lot and write where people can read the output, not just a personal diary, although definitely do that too. I've written every day since 2010. And if you go to joshuaspodek.com, you'll see I have a blog post every single day. And one day in the middle of it, when I started writing my book, I wanted to experience doing business writing. And I happened to meet someone who was an ink editor. And I said, I wonder if I could write for ink. And he said, well, do you have any samples? I was like, yeah, I got 5 years of daily posts. Very simple for me to get started with ink. When my book agent asked for samples, I could point to hundreds of thousands at that point of posts. And more than just writing, there's all the side stuff of how do you get the location where you write? How do you get peace and quiet? How do you deal with, like, your butt hurts, your shoulders hurt, and how do you handle these things? These little details that you might think are kind of side things that can really derail you if you don't have it down. Whereas if you write a lot every day, it doesn't have to be every day, but although it works for me, it really works things out, and it becomes just about getting your ideas out and exploring them as opposed to those hassles you've worked out already. That's the biggest thing, is to write a lot and write where people can read it so it's publicly viewable.
So you've actually written a daily blog since 2010. So you've been doing this for 9 years straight?
Yeah, and I don't miss it. If you look, as far as I know, there's no missing days. And there have been times when I went to North Korea for 2 weeks, so there's no internet there. So I had to write posts ahead of time to post on those days. And then I've done meditation retreats where there's no talking or reading or writing or internet connection. And so I have to post ahead of time. And that kind of discipline, when I hear the great writers whose writing practices I want to emulate, they're very consistent. They write, their discipline is there. And I didn't start with a lot of discipline. I needed it. And that's why I had to do these things, to develop that. Now, other writers might write differently, but that's what worked for me.
And for your daily blogs, your daily entries, how long are they typically on average? It's ballpark.
They're rarely below 500 words and rarely above 1,500 words.
That's quite a lot of writing every day.
Other things is you develop skills. I really thought when I first started writing my blog that I'd have a couple dozen really good posts and then I'd run out of ideas. But it turns out that you develop the skill of coming up with ideas. Not everyone will agree that my ideas are interesting to them. I hope they do, but they're interesting to me. When you write every day, there's going to be a lot of filler or a lot of things like, it's like midnight, I just want to go to sleep, I got to get something out, and I just pump something out. But I think it's, in terms of quality ideas, quantity, I believe, is the route to quality. And the more that you write, the more bad ideas you write, the more great ideas will emerge.
So with doing this daily entry, how long do you typically dedicate a day to do this? Since clearly you have this now as a daily habit. So how is that done?
Yeah, it depends on the post, because every now and then I'll have something that I really want to work on. And there have been ones that I've spent weeks developing. I'm writing other posts, but I spend time every day working on that one. And there's some that I churn out in a few, I want to go to sleep, I just got to get this thing out. A weird thing happens. A lot of the ones that I just pump out in 15 minutes get more comments and more interest, which I have to figure out why that is and be able to replicate that. But if I really got to pump one out, I can put it up in 10, 15 minutes, more 30 minutes to an hour.
How do you plan your daily writing topic?
I have, usually it comes from life, and there's something that hits me and I think this is interesting and I want to write about it, or I want to explore an idea. I also have a file of ideas that I keep at the ready. So when I have to do those really quick ones, I don't try to think of a new idea. I just write something there. Sometimes it comes from the media or something that's important to me. Lately, because of my podcast, I have a podcast called the Leadership in the Environment podcast. So there's been a lot on leadership, especially as it relates to the environment lately. And that's led me to working with a lot of big writers, Dan Pink, Seth Godin, Marshall Goldsmith, Elizabeth Kolbert, and working with them has led to trying to emulate them and follow in their footsteps. So after talking to someone like that, I'll start, like right now, I'm in the middle of a book by Doug Rushkoff, who's this big thought leader. And it's making me think a lot. And so that's leading me to write stuff on what he's written. Yeah, if I'm reading stuff that will influence me. Again, it's you develop, or at least I've developed the skill of developing ideas and sensing ideas.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, because that takes a lot of discipline and it takes a lot of focus to be able to write an entry a
I hope
day
it helps other.
for the.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying, just to be able to do that for 9 years straight is incredible. So you have my respect. That's really an incredible accomplishment.
I hope it helps others. And I want to reiterate, a lot of people say that it takes a lot of discipline, but in my mind, it's the opposite. It gives a lot of discipline. It's like lifting weights develops muscles. Some people would say you have to have muscles to lift heavy weights, but I think it's you have to lift weights to develop the muscles. And if I didn't, I grew up watching a lot of TV. If without something, a structure like this, I would not be able to develop the discipline that I need to continue it. So I think of it as the less discipline I have, the more I want to do this.
Well, what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
When I look at people who have published and people who haven't published, the biggest difference with the people who haven't published is that they don't seem to have representation. And it could be an agent. That's what made a big difference for me. But having professionals working with you, and you can hire an editor, and I can tell you that getting a professional to help is a world of difference compared to just getting friends and family or just myself. I catch a lot of interesting edits, changes that I could do, and my friends and family help, but there's nothing that's matched a professional. And I was lucky. For me, I had a friend who introduced me to a friend of his when I was working my first book, and I started working with her, and she acted as she was an editor and a promoter, and it was my first professional working with someone. And there's a quantum change from working with her. And, another big thing was she switched me to writing a proposal, which now seems obvious, but at the time I resisted. And now that I'm working on my next book, even though I could start writing it, I'm instead going to start with a proposal, because thinking at that level, an outline level, forcing myself to think of who the market is, who's going to buy this, what are the other books that are out there, who are the other authors that are out there. That kind of professional structure, at first I thought, I just want to write a book. And now I think and I thought that was all just for the publishers. I thought it was for them and extra work for me, but now I see that it helps me as well. That's my view. And I'm sure other people would say, I just want to write a book. And maybe for fiction, it's different. Mine's all nonfiction. And mine are generally based on courses that I've taught. And so I know the material very well. But anyway, that professional element is, I think, it's hard to get started. I got lucky, but I think it's also the biggest difference between unpublished people and published people.
Yeah, and having a professional editor, I think that's the best investment that you can make. I always talk about the 3 keys. First key, having a great looking book cover. Second key is having a well-edited professional book. Even if you go the indie route, you can have a book just as professional as any Big 5 publisher, as long as you have the best editor. Really does make such a huge difference. And then having a compelling book description as well to go with it.
Yeah, and that advice, I jumped into it because I'm friends with the guy, Neil Strauss, who wrote The Game, and multiple #1 bestselling author. And I asked him the same question, and he said, work with a professional editor. And that's why I didn't hesitate to follow that advice. He sold a lot of books.
Absolutely. Now, with your books, did you go through the traditional route, or did you go through the indie route?
The first couple books I did were self-published, and I don't really count them because they were really a bunch of blog posts that I put together into books. And I think they're very valuable books. And I think people who buy those books are going to get a lot out of them. But I don't count them as like, then Leadership Step by Step was my first with a traditional publisher, and it was Amicom. And that took things to a whole other level because it got me entree into the big bookstores and things like that. This next one I'm doing with Page Two Publishing, which is, as I see it, they're in between, they're kind of halfway between traditional publishing and self-publishing. And they have a slightly different business model. But another friend of mine, Michael Bugge-Stanier, he wrote a book on coaching, and he wrote an article where he talked about how he had sold 180,000 books, and he credited a lot to Page Two. And I was like, well, he's a friend of mine. He recommends them. He's done very well by them. And actually, last I heard, he was over 500,000 books. So that kind of sales tells me that, and I like working with them.
Well, and that's going to transition perfectly to our next question. And that is to please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that worked well.
I went heavy with going on podcasts. And for my first book, I showed up on 60, maybe 70 podcasts, which led to being on broadcast. And that got me out the most, I think. It also developed a lot of relationships with podcasters, which has led to my current podcast. I mean, you can't knock, I mean, you got to start with quality. I think if the book is not great, then all the marketing in the world, it might help you somewhat, but I think you have to have that quality. I don't know if that counts as a marketing strategy. I hope people listening to this are writing quality books. I guess another thing, I put a lot of effort into getting recommendations on my book pages. And last I checked, I'm up above, I'm like 4.9 stars with 80, something like 80 reviews. And actually, only the first few of them are people that I know, but I think that's seeded. I got some really great reviews. Like, for example, I didn't even know Amazon had video reviews. And on this book on leadership, a guy who graduated at Annapolis, which is one of the great schools for learning leadership, Annapolis, for the Navy. And he just starts off by saying, I didn't think you could teach leadership, but this book changed everything. And now I believe you can teach leadership, and this is how. And I think reviews like that have helped sales a lot.
So with the reviews, did you solicit any of these reviews, or did they just come through your sales?
Yeah, at the beginning, I certainly got my friends and family to write the first couple ones, but I don't have that many friends and family. And then at the beginning, I would make copies available for people, and I wouldn't force them to write a review, but I'd say, I hope you write a review. The general thing is, if you like it, I hope you write a 5-star review if you feel it deserves it. And if you don't like it, I hope you'll email me and tell me how I could improve it. And hopefully I've got one-star review, I think, and the rest are almost all 5-star and a couple 4-star. And I don't think I pushed that effort as much as I could have, because I know some people are constantly pushing for more reviews. So I could probably do a little better on that one. I certainly go to reviews when I'm buying a book myself.
Well, you mentioned that you went on 60 to 70 different podcasts. So what was your process for getting on those shows?
The first ones, I had to lean on people to help me make the connections. And I was very, very nervous the first couple times. It felt kind of weird to talk to a microphone and not really have a face that I was on the other side. But after the first few, I got much more comfortable. And my strategy for being on the podcast was to give value to the listeners. And so I'd want to understand what the podcast strategy was about, what the host was getting at. And if that meant not necessarily talking as much about my book, I'd favor delivering value. And for several podcasts, I was the first person they'd invite back for a second time or for a third time, which I attribute to being valuable for their listeners and their community. Is that the best strategy for selling books? I don't think it hurts. And it certainly helps me create those relationships with podcasters. And then at the end of every podcast, I would say, anyone else whose audience would benefit from hearing about me or hearing about my book? And so that word of mouth, it's not word of mouth. It's, I would asking for referrals was a big thing.
Yeah, and that is a great strategy. So you get done with the show, go, hey, just want to know if you know of any other shows out there that you feel like it add value to. That is a perfect hook.
Yeah, and every now and then someone would say, oh, I happen to know 5 people. And then suddenly I got a whole bunch more.
Yeah, I bet
And
you
now that
take.
helped me a lot because a lot of people said, you should have, after a while, people would tell me, you should have a podcast. And then when leadership in the area of the environment seemed to me one of the most important areas to apply leadership in 2018, 2019, then I was prepared to start a podcast. And that's leading to its whole other, as you know, that leads to more and more opportunities.
It really does. It's amazing. I always talk about the book being the foundation of your business platform. The next level up is hosting your own podcast because it really does increase your platform. And one of the things I always refer to a podcast or being featured in a magazine or in a blog, I refer to that as a point of exposure. Now, is that specific point of exposure going to spike your sales? It might, but most likely it's just going to give you an extra point of exposure where someone looks up your name on Google. Like they type in Paul G. Brodie author. They're going to see a ton of information. They're going to see articles from local magazines like Arlington Today. They might see features in national publications. But what they're also going to see are a ton of different podcast shows that I've been on. But they're also going to see my own podcast and the amazing guests that we've had on the show. I mean, Joshua, your episode 234, where this is, every single episode is that point of exposure where we're having these great conversations. But the other thing is it's going to be registered in Google where people can find more information about you. And the more information they find, the better. Because if they type in your name and they find a couple things, that's okay. But when they can find 100 to 200 different things, it really does help with those points of exposure and increase in your authority and additional credibility as well.
Yeah, and it builds to more and more because when they see something, when someone from the media wants to contact you, if they see that it's there, then if they want to contact someone and you're relevant, they'll find you. And now if they write about you, then that helps the next person find you. And that's why it's so helpful to help other people. Yeah. Because the more that you help them, the more that what they do is going to end up helping you, whether you meant for that to happen or not.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book? And what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Now, picking a favorite book is pretty tough.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you what I usually say, but I'm going to go with this slightly different. I usually say Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Perennially rated one of the top 10 books of the 20th century of all time. But I'm going to mention the Tao Te Ching, the book that Taoism is based on, and in particular, a translation by Ron Hogan, which is available for free. If you just look up Tao Te Ching and Ron Hogan, there's a free download. It's a Creative Commons license, so you can also buy a printed copy. And it's very difficult for me to describe what it gives to me, but I will say this about it. I don't know if people have read it, but it's not written, it's not prose, and it's not poetry. It's written in its own way. And you can spend a month just on one chapter, which might be one page, and you can spend 5 minutes on it, and you get different things from it. And here's what happens, is that after I read it, I find my life improved. And I can't always describe why or how. It's kind of like a Zen koan, and it just makes you think and behave in slightly different ways, and it's always been something that I've come back to. And that particular translation, anyone who downloads it or buys it, you'll see in the description how he comes about it in a different way than most translators do. He doesn't speak Chinese. He got a whole bunch of different translations and put it together in a way of modern English in a visceral, guttural, gutsy Anglo-Saxon language. And I expect that I'll go back to that book, a couple times a year for the rest of my life. Of course, my next book, which is titled Initiative, I can't help but name that one as well. I really love how it's come out, and it comes out in May.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
My favorite quote is by a woman, and she's known as the Picasso of dance, Martha Graham. And it's a statement about how to learn performance things. And she's talking about dance. But what she talks about could just as well apply to leadership, to entrepreneurship, which is what I write about and what I teach. But it could apply to learning sport or learning music. And so it's going to be about dance. What you hear is she's going to use the word dancer, but almost anything, being a parent, being some performance-based, it applies. This is the quote. The dancer is realistic. His craft teaches him to be. Either the foot is pointed or it is not. No amount of dreaming will point it for you. This requires discipline, not drill, not something imposed from without, but discipline imposed by you yourself upon yourself. Your goal is freedom, but freedom may only be achieved through discipline. In the studio, you learn to conform, to submit yourself to the demands of your craft so that you may finally be free. I just love how she talks about discipline and how you develop freedom, and the juxtaposition of saying you get freedom through conforming, but it's not doing what you're told. It's doing, scales, doing drills, doing exercises that develop your skills. And likewise, that it just tells, to me, that's what it takes to become great, to master a discipline.
Joshua, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
So joshuaspodek.com is the connection to everything. So it's JOSHUASPODEK.com. And then in the upper right corner, so you can click to get to the podcast. And then you can read all the posts. If you look under blog, then there's my favorite posts. So joshuaspodek.com. And then if you click connect, you can email me as well.
Joshua, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Paul, thank you very much as well.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.